Ladies and gentlemen, welcome wrestling fans worldwide to Knoxville and the Great Smoky Mountains for the Ron Fuller Tennessee Studcast.
6 feet 9 inches tall, 265 pounds.
This historic podcast from one of the most respected and successful wrestlers and promoters will follow the footsteps of the largest and oldest wrestling family on the planet.
Listen to what I'm saying. That's right. Bring that camera in here a little bit closer.
Through 93 years and 4 generations.
The stud has arrived.
Old school or new fan, this unique broadcast will educate and captivate as Ron details decades of professional wrestling's growth with truly unforgettable stories.
I want those people out there at home to hear the stud.
Sit back and enjoy the ride with the Tennessee Stud.
The Tennessee Stud. You will learn that name. You will remember it.
And now,
the stud is here.
All right, let's make it happen. It's another Studcast with the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm David Summers. Here we go with the story of wrestling in America, as told by the Stud, whose family started the profession 100 years ago. Now we step back into the ring, back into time. Off we go to the Great Smoky Mountains. That's where we find the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. What do you say, my man, Ron?
Hey, man. Good to be with you here. We got a pretty cloudy day here, but, we got some beautiful leaves, Dave. Wow, it's really beautiful this fall. It has been for the last week or two, and I guess we'll probably keep these leaves for another couple of weeks, but we've had a freezing temperature already, which is most unusual. But, wow, it's a beautiful place to be, man. That's for sure.
All right, so I saw you in a postcard setting the other day. You had a beautiful river behind you, and you were surrounded by some of those beautiful leaves. Where was that? What river was that?
Well, that was actually, we were close to a dam, Douglas Dam, Douglas Lake, which is in the very eastern part of the state, just not too far from the North Carolina border, actually.
Wow.
Beautiful, beautiful lake. Wow, as you could tell in the background and the leaves, you got to see some leaves. And I'll try to do quite a bit of that in the near future here, man, because I want people to be able to see some of these sites. It's a beautiful state here, man. God's country, I call it.
Oh, no doubt. And it's so awesome that you have time to spend that kind of time in your beloved home of Tennessee, and it's so beautiful, and time is a real factor. Listen, I know this. You have worked so hard on these Studcast. This is episode number 272. So only a couple of weeks ago, you missed a week, and it was just really based on time. You had a computer issue. You had a couple of other things, and I know how much pressure you've put on yourself literally over the years with every episode. And if we were delayed starting it on a Tuesday, it was because I'm not finished with the research. I still have research. And then to me, it was like, hey, Ron ain't going nowhere until he gets it right. So it's Wednesday. So today is a little different. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess we could probably try to explain to fans, as you said. I do a lot of research, and sometimes I can't finish them by Tuesday, and it goes on into Wednesday. And so I think we're just going to try to make Wednesday the day that we're going to release the Studcast in the future. There may be occasionally a one on a Tuesday if I can push it there. But I want us to be regular, and I want us fans to know what day to expect it. And so we're doing this one on Wednesday. We're going to try to do as many as possible from now on, release them on Wednesdays. I really, really appreciate, obviously, all the listeners out there. And wow, I missed a week, and, and the coming back, the last Studcast was another record. I mean, people kind of missed it, obviously, not getting that one. But we're back up and doing it now, my man, and we got a great one today.
Hey, no doubt. And the other thing I know, too, is that you enjoy being out on the weekends and being able to see your state. And so you started the show on Sundays. You were still working on it on Monday, still working on it on Tuesday. And that's a good reason to move this thing another day. It gives you a little more time to enjoy yourself. And I think you certainly have earned that. Listen, you said we got a good one. You bet we got a good one. And the Studcast are really rocking, Ron. So we've got another record broken with the last one. Listeners are loving the first two-territory operation in professional wrestling history and its stories. You were a groundbreaker in the sport in the 70s and the 80s, the only promoter and owner to split his NWA territory, much less make both of them successful. So that's an amazing story right there, Stud.
Well, I was blessed with some of the best wrestlers in history, man, during 1978 and 79. And it had taken me about 3 years with Southeastern Knoxville to make it the best small territory in the world. And in March of 1978, we opened the second territory, Southeastern Gulf Coast, about 500 miles to the south. And that it had been losing money for a few years. Before I purchased it, actually, Jim Barnett and the Georgia promoters purchased it before I did. They gave it back because they couldn't make it happen. And then we were able to remarkably turn that territory around in only 6 months. So by August of 1978, Southeastern Gulf Coast had caught up with the Gates in Tennessee, and then that territory, all over that territory. And it was proven to be a great buy for us at that point.
All right, so the title for this episode on this Studcast is Alabama Three Fullers, Tennessee Russian Death Match. All right, you mentioned being blessed with great wrestlers in both territories, but I don't think that we've really ever named them all and given them all credit for Southeastern's success like in 1978. Would you want to take a shot at recognizing as many as you could, Stud? I know that's one of the things you do. I mean, from the smallest jobber, as they call it, you've always recognized these guys. Just the ones, maybe the ones in this episode alone. So I'll see if I can count them as you go. You want to do that?
That should be really interesting, Dave. I don't know exactly how many myself, but I have the cards in front of me. So let's start with the future NWA World Champion, Ronnie Garvin. He's going to win the World Championship several years after Southeastern was done. You also got in the territory the human tank. I'm going to call him Tanaka. I mean, he basically was a human tank. Yeah. You had the great Malenko. You had a former Olympic wrestler, Bob Roop. You had a Hall of Famer in the Southern Territory, Bob Armstrong. European star, big time, Tony Charles. My brother Robert. My dad is involved in this one. He'll be involved in the next one, as a matter of fact. And then you got we had a future superstar of the Rock and Roll Express tag team, Robert Gibson. And then the wrestler that was famous for the slap heard around the world, man. Another Hall of Famer, David Schultz.
Dr. D.
Then the incomparable Mongolian Stomper, Dennis Condrey, the only member of every Midnight Express combination. And that was one of the best-known tag teams in history. Got a great young baby face in this time frame. And was a member of the present Knoxville crew. And he's going to be a great future heel. One of the dudes from the dark side, Kevin Sullivan. You got the legendary Ron Wright. You got Norvell Austin. You got Jimmy Golden. You got Gorgeous George Jr. Just basically to name a few.
All right, so I was trying to keep up, and if I got it right, I counted 18, and those are huge stars. I count 9 more on the 2 cards in front of me on this Studcast that you didn't even mention by name. That brings the total number of wrestlers under the 2 territory Southeastern banner to 27 in the 3rd week of October of 1978. That's a big crew, dude.
Well, I never added up the numbers, to be honest with you, man. But at that time in 1978, that was probably as many or more wrestlers than any of the largest territories in the world at that point.
Wow. So, in essence, it's just 30 years old. You're 30 years old. You owned and operated one of the largest wrestling territories in the world.
That's a good point. I never thought about that like that either, Dave. But,
right.
But I guess I really was. So So no wonder I was always so darn tired, man.
See, this was weird for me because I've known you for a while, and I've always seen you as a businessman, and I keep forgetting you were 30 freaking years old when all this was happening. All right, so who wouldn't have been tired, Ron? All right, so where do we ride today? How do we get this Studcast rolling?
Well, we're going to change it up a little bit, this Studcast. We're going to begin this one in the southeastern Gulf Coast. The cards in Alabama and Florida were at this point rivaling those in the Tennessee territory. The card in the three major cities, Montgomery, Mobile, and Dothan, in the week of October 18, 1978, was probably the best card yet in southeastern Gulf Coast. And we're going to look at that card. We'll discuss the TV that promoted it. We'll talk about the results of it and the attendance in all three of those cities. Then we're going to ride north into Tennessee with the Friday night card of October 20th, 1978. We'll discuss the TV that promoted that card. We'll get the results of the matches and the attendance. And we'll take another short dive into the coming Knoxville War, 1979. And we got a lot of ground to cover, but hopefully we'll have enough time to maybe even throw a learning tree question in at the end of it.
All right, so it sounds like another great one, no doubt. So since we're riding south first this time, what was the card for the three major markets in southeastern Gulf Coast?
It was loaded, man. Charlie Cook opened the night against Norvell Austin. What a great opening match. Greg Peterson faced off against David Schultz. Robert Gibson faced off against Assassin number 2 in a loser leave Southeastern Conference Gulf Coast match. Robert Fuller met Don Carson in an I Quit match. And that was the way that match worked is the only way that to win, you had to have the wrestler that you were wrestling to give up or quit over the PA system for the entire crowd to hear it. So, it was kind of an unusual type of match, but rarely had them. But this was going to be one between my brother and Don Carson. Then the Assassin and their manager, Billy Spears, were going to be in a return match, and they were going to get a chance to win their belts back from the new tag champions, Bob Armstrong and Tony Charles. The main event was the Mongolian Stomper, managed by Gorgeous George Jr., and he was going to be getting his first try for my Gulf Coast, which was soon going to be called the Southeastern Championship belt.
Wow. All right, so I think you're exactly right, Ron. This 6-match card was probably the best one yet in Southeastern Gulf Coast. So what about the TV that set this whole thing up that really just sets the whole stage for it?
Well, it was also a great TV, Dave. For the first time in Southeastern Gulf Coast, this TV had videos from all three of the major markets. So fans watching at home who had never been to a live event in their arena yet were going to see their local buildings in that city full with the fact that, that something special enough to be recorded happened there. When we went and recorded them, it made it special to fans in those local areas. And this particular week, all the buildings are packed. And in addition to this type of experience in each market, and because Gordon Sully was no longer doing the show with Charlie Platt, we're going to start giving Charlie Platt, on occasion, a guest commentator. So this week's guest was a very special one. Actually, he was a historic one based upon Gulf Coast wrestling history. It was the man responsible for the birth of Gulf Coast wrestling 24 years earlier, in 1954. It was my dad, Buddy Fuller.
Wow. Okay, that's cool, Ron. All right, so it's no wonder we started down south today. This is going to be indeed a really special TV and opportunity for fans of an older generation to see one of their stars. So how do you kick this show off? What was up first?
Well, it would open up, obviously, with Charlie and my father at the set. And Charlie was extremely polite, as always. And he made some really glowing remarks about who my father was, explained a little bit to those younger fans out there who had no idea, probably. And he really expressed how honored he was to have my father as a guest commentator. And then they were joined by a Pensacola-born wrestler, Robert Gibson. Man, we're keeping it down in the Gulf Coast for sure. They played a video. from the Monday night before in Montgomery's beautiful downtown Civic Center, a beautiful building. And it was all about Robert Gibson's match with Norvell Austin. Then in the match, it showed that Gibson was in control. The referee collided with Robert, and the referee went rolling out of the ring. And when he did, both assassins, wrestling in a later match, they weren't involved in this match at all, not even real close friends of Norvell Austin, anybody knew. But they came down, they hit the ring, and they attacked Ricky Gibson. And he explained that to his brother. He explained, Robert's watching it, that his brother, Ricky, had lost a loser-leave match less than a month earlier and was gone from Southeastern Wrestling. And immediately after he left, he said that it seemed like that the Assassins and Billy Spears started making a target out of him. So the video then showed both Assassins. They snatched him up. They double pile drived him while Norvell stood there and watched them. Then they left the ring. Austin went over, helped the referee back into the ring, went over and covered Ricky Gibson for the win. The studio fans, it was really they talk about a kind of a real bad screw job. That really was. So, And then so Robert said after this match that he had asked the Gulf Coast officials to allow him to meet either one of the two assassins. He didn't care which one, in a loser-leave match the very next week. He was tired of being a target, and so they agreed, and the match was set. And then he that when he won that match, he said he wanted the other assassin in a loser-leave match, and that he was going to try to get even for his brother, and he was going to try to eliminate both assassins in loser-leave matches over the next 2 weeks. And then he said he would watch Billy Spears disappear from the area because he's not going to have any wrestlers. So the studio fans, obviously, they loved the idea, and they were still applauding when Robert went to the ring for the first live match of the TV show. And during that match, my father had some very nice comments about both Ricky and Robert, the Pensacola boys, that they were, both on their way to a big future in wrestling, which was definitely the case. And there was actually an understatement in Robert Gibson's case, because he was headed to the Rock and Roll Express, one of the greatest tag teams ever in the history of the sport. So Robert Gibson got himself another win. The dad left the set before Billy Spears and his assassin team arrived for the first interview. And because this TV had the same card in all three major markets, all the interviews in it were going to be generic and about the same matches in all three cities, because the card's going to be the same in all three cities. So that being the case, they were placed these interviews directly into the show as it was being recorded, rather than having to pre-record them. So everything was done a little differently. This show went out intact as it had done from beginning to end. Spears, obviously, he was there with his boys. And he was still upset a little bit about the cake in the face incident from the week before.
No.
You can imagine that. And then he was more upset for hearing for the first time that one of his men was going to have to wrestle in a loser-leave match the following week. And then go back in the ring the same night for a second match to try to get their belts back from Bob Armstrong and Tony Charles. And so, he had a little bit of a reason, I suppose, maybe.
All right. Well, but do you think he had a legitimate point? How often did that type of a night happen for a wrestler? I mean, a wrestler in a loser-leave match, then wrestle in a title match. That's a little unusual.
Well, it didn't happen very often, I can tell you that. But there were some situations in where a wrestler didn't show up, and one wrestler would have to wrestle in his place and wrestle twice. But you don't think the fans had any sympathy for him? They didn't care, right? Billy Spears had a ton of heat at that time. I don't think the fans would have cared if one of the assassins had to wrestle 5 times in a night. It wouldn't have made any difference to them. So the next segment opened with another video. This one had Bob Armstrong and Tony Charles at the set, and they had their newly won tag belts. And the Dothan studio fans had watched the win over the Assassins the night before. A lot of those fans that came to the studio were always at those Friday night matches live. And they had already seen that win the night before, and they went crazy when the new champs came out. They brought their belts. And then they watched their fantastic win, and the studio really celebrated with them, man. So they were basically, it was a Dothan video in this show as well. And then Armstrong and Charles, they actually made a great team. Wow. I mean, as you can imagine, Bob Armstrong could do it all, and Tony Charles could do it all too, but in a totally different way. So after the video, they went to the ring and they proved how good they were. And my father was back at the set with Charlie at this point, and he made some great comments that he legitimately believed about both wrestlers in the ring and how they were undoubtedly two of the best in the world. He wasn't exaggerating, actually, when he said that either, not at all. So then Bob and Tony, they, brought their belts back to the set after the match that they won easily, and they did the second interview. And they were ready for their first title defense and happy to see that one of the assassins was putting his future on the line against Robert Gibson before the match, right? And maybe, they said that also that could roll into the second assassin be having to go into a loser leave town match if Gibson were to beat the first one. And, Billy Spears was, he had to be really, really upset by this. And obviously, before they finished that interview, they spent a little time wishing Robert Gibson good luck, man, in this upcoming loser leave town match with one of the assassins. Personality profile was next. It had 3 men on it with Charlie. And thankfully, they had cleaned up that area where Billy Spears had his face smashed into the cake the week before. I guess they brought in a crew to clean it up because it was a real mess.
Don't step in that, right?
And those 3 on there were the Fullers. It was me, Rob, and Buddy. And so Robert and our father, Buddy, had joined Charlie. There were a lot of early conversations, about the great territory my father had built in the Gulf Coast in the 1950s. And he had this classic match. They talked a little bit about the classic match in 1958 in Ladd Memorial Football Stadium in Mobile with Mario Galento against my dad. And that drew almost 40,000 fans in 1958. My father spoke about how proud he was of us, had a little bit of that. And then finally, we watched a video from Mobile that had occurred 3 nights earlier. It was the match between myself and the Mongolian Stomper, and it got totally out of control. Gorgeous George Jr. got it started when he came in the ring. Tried to assist his Stomper. When the referee went down, he made his move. He tried to help his Stomper. Robert ended up coming to the ring, and he started taking care of Gorgeous George. Don Carson showed up, and he and Gigi were doing a job on Robert. And our father, it was a sold out, had thousands of people, and some got turned away. A lot of them got turned away from Expo Hall. And you could tell from the crowd noise in the video when my dad hit the ring. There was already full of guys in the ring, but when he got there, there was kind of an explosion in that building. And the referee stopped the match. He called it a no contest. And when the 4 heels took a powder and they headed to the dressing room, you could hardly see them, man, fighting their way back to the dressing room because they were surrounded by a mass of humanity. Those fans in Mobile were crazy, and wow, it was a dangerous place to wrestle.
I wish I could reference the exact Studcast or Super Studcast about your father, that match in Ladd Stadium. Most of us young bucks were not here in 1958. Mobile, Alabama against Mario Galento. That is one of the most legendary matches. And in 1958, almost 40,000 people were there for that. I wish I could say which Studcast that it is, and maybe because that's one people need to know about, because that truly is the history of wrestling. All right, and that sounded like a historic video in a historic TV show. So, wow. All right, so what's next, Ron?
Well, Rob and I were dressed, during this profile when we went there and ready for the ring. And We had not been a tag team together for a very long time at this point. It'd been close to 2 years since we'd had a tag match together. And the studio crowd, they didn't care, man. They erupted, and we went straight from the profile right into the ring. And we did finish, though, what we hadn't done as a team. We did something in this match that we hadn't done since 1975. And we talked about it before going to the ring. We said, wow, if we can do this, I would love to be able to put this together and make this happen. So we were all four in the ring at the end of that match. And I knocked the guy that was with me out of the ring. Rob threw his guy into the ropes. He bent over, and he gave him a backdrop. And the guy went high up in the air. And when he started down, I caught him up in the air, upside down at his highest point. And it was kind of like a belly to back. He had my belly to his back, and his head was pointed straight down toward the mat. I threw my legs out from underneath me, and I dropped my rear end as hard as I could, and the back of his head landed on that mat with all of his weight and mine on it.
Oh, my God.
Sounded like an explosion in the ring. It always did. This bump was it just tore people up in the arenas.
Wow.
And it sounded like an explosion in the ring, and it also sounded like an explosion in the bleachers. The fans went, whoa, like, wow. The crowd popped, obviously, and it was one of the most devastating moves in wrestling. It always looked like it killed the guy, you know, and a lot of times they didn't get up. So we went straight to the set for the next interview. The studio crowd was still on its feet, and Robert told everybody what he intended to do in his I Quit match with Don Carson the next week. I took my Gulf Coast belt. I held it up over my head, told Gorgeous George Jr., you want the belt? Bring your animal. Turn him loose, because we got the equalizer. And about that time, my dad stepped into the shot. And he got between Rob and I, and we all three grabbed each other by the wrist, raised our hands above our head, and I shouted, we're all Fullers. And on our worst day, the three of you don't have a chance. Don Carson's going to lose. I Quit. Stomper's going to I'm going to stomp the Stomper. And then I'd hate to be Gorgeous George Jr., or anybody else that gets involved, because you definitely don't want my dad in the ring.
That had to be an incredible pop. So how do you finish that show out?
Well, it was time for some heat, man, and the Stomper. We'd had 3 babyface wins at this point. Bob Armstrong and Tony Charles, Robert Gibson. So now it was time for Stomper and Carson and Gigi. And I don't know about Gigi and Carson, but I know the Stomper was ready, because when that came time for them to leave the dressing room, the Stomper was the first one out. He didn't head to the ring. He went straight for the bleachers and the fans. And Carson and Gigi, they were trying to hold him back. And as it had been since he had got there, the very first TV show, he nearly cleared the bleachers of fans. They all ran again. They ran all over the studio. A lot of them went out the front door where they came in. And for the first time, some of them on this run actually went out the back door where the babyface dressing room was. So as you can imagine, it was pandemonium in the studio. And then when the Stomper finally hit the ring with Carson, they just demolished the 2 poor guys who were in there. And some of the studio crowd had not even made it back in the building yet. The bleachers were half empty, and the match was over. The fans hadn't come back because they were so afraid of the Stomper. Didn't blame them much myself, I got to tell you. So both of their young opponents were bleeding, and they double pinned them together at the same time. And the ring announcer was even afraid to come back to the ring to announce the results of the match. So then Stomper, he turned his attention on the set, man, and it was time for the interview. So he charged the set. My dad had already left the set, but the Stomper seemed like he was kind of looking for it. And then the last interview started, but there was no, when that last interview got underway, the Stomper this time didn't have that truck shock with him, man, that he was cranking. He was way beyond that this time. He was out of control. Carson and Gigi were trying to get control of him. He kept shoving them. He even shoved Charlie a couple of times and pushed his head down on the desk one time.
Charlie
and he
Platt
kept looking into the cameras and shouting, ooh, ooh, like he would do, man. Wow, he had this wild look on his face. So the first 3 matches of the show made it seem like this was going to be an all babyface affair. But by golly, the Mongolian Stomper, he took all that away in less than 10 minutes. I mean, he took control. And Charlie had a hard time even closing the show because the Stomper was still at it. He was refusing to go to the dressing room. He was still out in front of Charlie when he was closing the show. He wanted to get
Oh my God. I remember those shows, and we all remember those shows when we were kids, and we're running out of time, and it's just mayhem at the end of the show, and you got the Stomper. Nobody's leaving that. That is an awesome TV show. All right, it had to be one of the best of all time, really. So what about the result of this card in all 3 major markets the next week?
Well, Norville Austin beat Charlie Cook, and wow, it was a very good opening match. I watched it all 3 nights, and it had 2 great veterans. It had to be good, and it was an absolutely fantastic way to open up a card. Then Dr. D, David Schultz, he dominated poor little Greg Peterson, man, in all 3 of those cities. Don Carson won the I Quit match, and it went quite a while with both men refusing to give up on the house microphone, and Rob kept working Carson's leg when he could get to it. He was trying to get the full leg lock on him because this is basically a submission match, and he finally got it. And when he did, it was basically should have been over. It was a surefire win at that point. The referee got the microphone. The referee, every time a man was down and in a position where he might submit, the referee would get the microphone and he would put it into the man's face. And he had to say, I quit over the microphone. And so he was standing, the referee standing right over Carson. He's laying there on his back. Rob's got the fuller leg lock on him. And he's got the microphone down in Carson's face and asking him if he quits. And Carson reached up and he grabbed the ref, man, by the shirt. And he jerked him down on top of both him and Robert. And the hole was broken. Obviously, when that happened, Rob couldn't hang on to the hole because the referee fell face first into Rob's knee.
Ooh.
And it about knocked the referee out. He was laying on top of Rob. And Carson had to crawl out of the leg lock, basically. And then at that point, here come both the assassins. They came to the ring. They rolled the ref off of Rob. They double pile drive Rob. Then he went back to the dressing room before the ref even saw him, and ref finally got back on his feet. Carson couldn't stand up after the pain of the leg lock, so he crawled over and he put a sleeper hold on Rob, like he was the one responsible for putting Rob to sleep while the referee didn't see it. But finally, the ref got over to where he was. He brought the microphone to Rob for Rob to give up, and then the ref realized that Rob was out. So he lifted his arm 3 times, which was the normal thing for a sleeper hold. Mm-hmm. And Rob dropped it all 3 times. The ref rang the bell and he raised Carson's hand. Well, as you can imagine, the crowd was pretty upset by that since the assassins had actually done the dirty work. Mm-hmm. And so in the next match, it was just as hot as that one. So it was Robert Gibson taking on assassin number 2. And the loser of the match had to leave Southeastern. So Gibson was very strong through that whole match. And then he finally got his hands on Billy Spears at the end of that match. And then while the second referee of the night, because the first referee had an injury, there was a second one, and he was handling this match. He was trying to separate them. Assassin number 1 came into the ring, nailed him from behind. And then when the referee went down, he pile drived Robert Gibson. He put his partner on top of him. He pulled the ref over to the wrestlers, and he went to the dressing room. And the ref counted Gibson out. He raised assassin number 2's hand in victory. And the building really went crazy at this point. Now, this is twice in a row this has happened.
All right, so that's, if I'm count this, that's 4 straight wins in the first 4 matches for the heels, right? Was that
Right.
was that best for business, Ron?
Well, and if you think back, man, when we opened Southeastern Gulf Coast about 8 months earlier, I used to say heat on the heels built business faster than anything.
Right.
So this particular night, we were really, really cranking it. So I think that's why we had come so far so fast as the territory, because they had a lot of heat on the heels since we had started that territory. And this night in particular was becoming one of those tremendous heel nights where heat from the finishes was going to go a long way to making the heels red hot again. So match number 5 might have saved the night from a horrible riot. I'll tell you that. If it had another one that went the wrong direction, I don't know what might have happened that night. But Bob Armstrong and Tony Charles, they successfully defended their tag belts against the Assassins and their manager, Billy Spears. And he had been, right there with his boys pretty much the whole night. They'd been involved in a couple of matches before their own. And you can only imagine, man, what a pop there was when Bob Armstrong put Assassin number 2 to sleep for the win of their first title defense, Tony Charles.
Wow.
So then the main event was for the now called at this point Southeastern Championship. And the Mongolian Stomper, managed by Gorgeous George Jr., was obviously getting his first shot at the title. And I'd become kind of an overnight babyface sensation at this point. Fans really had gotten into me, and this match was kind of for all the marbles. So, and because of what had happened already during the night, the fans were really ready for this one. And so was my father, but not my brother. I mean, he'd been double pile drived, and that kind of ended his night. He wasn't able to come back out and even watch this match. So I took the match, man, to the big monster, man, and the Stomper himself, and I had him on the ropes, and I covered him for pins several times, but he kicked out. He was in such phenomenal shape, and what a tremendous athlete he was. And then finally, Gigi, he had to make his move to try to save his meal ticket, man, because I thought I was gonna just beat him in the middle, and I got my hands on Gigi, and when I did, man, the building exploded. Boy, I had my opportunity to kick Gigi's butt a little bit, and here they came again, man, the Assassins, man, and they'd put up, at this point, the Southeastern, they'd never come. They'd been involved in matches, but this is the first time I'd ever seen them involved in a match with the Stomper or Gigi. They had never stooped to that level. So my father was pretty well known in the business for being a little stiff in the ring, to be honest with you, Dave. Wrestlers didn't like to wrestle, Dad. And it'd been a long time at this point since Dad had a wrestling match. And the Assassins started into the ring, and I had no idea he was watching, much less he was right there. I had no idea he was right beside me or just behind me. The Assassins are coming in the ring. I never saw him until he football punted one of those guys in the face.
Oh my God.
He got on the apron of the ring, and he sent that 300-pounder flying into the front row of ringside.
God.
And took out people in the chairs. I was like, oh my God almighty, Dad, you killed him. Right? And then I grabbed the other one, and he was still bent over, coming through the ropes. And I gave him, man, what they had been giving everybody else that night. I gave one of those boys a pile driver. And the building was exploding at that point. Billy Spears, he came, got involved. He got in the ring, and gosh, Dad grabbed him, and he hit him with one of those roundhouse right hands that he was famous for. He knocked him in the next week, man. I think Billy Spears probably could even think for 2 days. Then the Stomper grabbed me from behind. Gigi went for a right hand. I ducked, and the Stomper got nailed by Gigi and got another huge pop. And then me and Dad were cleaning house, man. But we didn't notice probably the most backstabbing heel of all of them, man, was not accounted for. And then Don Carson arrived. He loaded his glove, and he was behind Dad, and Dad never saw him. He never saw him coming. Carson hit him in the back of the head with a loaded glove, and then I grabbed Carson, and guy went down on top of him, and I was trying to get even for it. Stomper got me from behind, and he held me for Carson, and Carson hit me with the glove, and that ended the night for me, just like it had for my father. So one referee had been knocked out during all this, and the second one arrived after Carson left the ring. Stomper rolled Dad out of the ring. He covered me, and I was counted out. The belt was given to the Stomper, and Gigi, Carson, Billy Spears, both assassins, just about the whole heel dressing room are in the ring, and they all got surrounded by the policemen in all three of the buildings that week, and they fought their way to the dressing room every night.
Did you ever in private have wrestlers coming up to you going, when's your dad getting the hell out of town?
Yeah. They always hated to see him come. Much less get their hands on him, his hands on him.
I can't be in the ring with him. Good God. Okay. All right. Listen, that's awesome, but I've never heard or seen anything like that. 6 men to beat 2. Those heels were lucky to get back to the dressing room, period. So how about attendance in all 3 major arenas for that week?
Well, Montgomery Civic Center had 3,900 in it, right at 4,000 people. Mobile's Auditorium, which was the bigger of the 2 buildings on that facility, had 7,000 people, man. It was right up there with the Harley race night. Dothan's Farm Center had 5,100. Those 3 total cities put together 16,000 fans for those 3 nights.
Wow.
And that territory had only been in business for 8 months. Pretty amazing.
Oh, absolutely. This is an incredible Studcast so far. I got to say that. All right, let's do this. Let's get our break in. And when we come back, we'll take a ride this time to the north as opposed to the south like we've been doing. And we'll head into southeastern Knoxville territory for a first ever tag team Russian death match. That is right after the break when we come back on this Studcast. Okay, and something unusual, I don't know what's up, but Ron, you said specifically you have something to say to our listeners during the break. You're not talking about, well, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but you go ahead. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, okay, great. Always you do the break, usually Dave, but I wanted to kind of apologize again for the missing 1 week because of a problem with my computer. But at the same time, I also want to thank fans out there. The Studcast continues to set records, and I really, really appreciate everybody's loyalty. And I also appreciate the fact that they seem to really like the fact that we've got 2 territories that we talk about in the Studcast now. And I want to look to the future a little bit and let fans know that we're about to get into 1979. And when we do, we're going to be talking about much more than just the wrestling matches themselves. We're going to be talking about one of the most unusual things in all of professional wrestling. We're going to be talking about a wrestling war a whole lot during 1979. How it gets started, why it happens. We're going to cover a whole lot of that. So we're doing a whole lot of things now. We've got 2 territories going, and I really just want to thank everybody for their support out there, for joining us for all these Studcasts, and it's only going to get better, fans.
Hey, I want to echo that too, Ron. I really appreciate listeners, and if folks hit me up on Facebook and they say, man, I love the way you and Ron go back and forth and you guys have fun on the Studcast. And listen, I got to say, Ron, you don't even have to be as forthcoming as you are about your free time. Your free time is your free time. You spend a tremendous amount of time putting these Studcasts together, and you've apologized enough, so you don't have to worry about that. We got your back on this. You missed what? 1 Studcast in 272. Can you try to do better, dude? Anyway, let's get back into the show. And listen, thanks for that. And listen, we do appreciate the listeners. That obviously, you wouldn't spend this research and this time like you do without so many listeners from so many places, literally around the world, and that means so much to both of us. Absolutely. All right, Stud, a lot to cover, so where do we ride first on the last half of this Studcast?
Well, man, we're going to head into Chilhowie Park's Jacob Building. We're going to be on Friday night, October the 20th, 1978. And the first match on this card was a return match from the week before that ended in a time limit draw. It was Terry Gibbs against George McCrary. And this time it was a 30-minute time limit. Went up from a 20-minute to a 30-minute time limit. Both these guys had great matches. Terry Gibbs was a gifted wrestler, and George McCrary was a legendary amateur wrestler. So, another great way is we opened up the card up down there in southeastern Gulf Coast with a great match. We're opening up one this way and up there in the north in Knoxville. And then the recently returning Mike Stallings was meeting newcomer, hippie, Mike Boyette. The next match on this card was the Ron Wright Bounty match. And I got to say this, Dave. I recently mentioned that bounty on another Studcast. Might have been the last one or the one before for sure. And I said it was for $10,000 to anyone that could put Kevin Sullivan in the hospital. Well, I had a great fan sent me on social media a photo of the original bounty offer from Ron Wright. And I found out there was only $5,000 rather than the $10,000. And obviously, I want to make this right, and I want to thank this gentleman for the photo and for keeping me as accurate as possible. Considering we're talking about events that happened 44 years ago, I'm going to get confused a little bit every once in a while about some of the facts, obviously, because we're dealing with a pretty good time spread here between these two events, the one we're doing now and what actually happened 44 years ago. So that bounty match was going to be between Kevin Sullivan and Ken Dillinger, and Ron Wright was going to be barred from ringside. Then the next match on that card was for the Southeastern Tag Championship. There was a no DQ clause in this contract. The team of Jimmy Golden and Rip Smith had won the belts on Friday, October 10th, just about a couple of weeks earlier. And Toru Tanaka had seconded them in that match in which they won the belts. Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson were obviously going to be wrestling them to try to regain the belts. And they were presented by at this point, he called himself Ron Wright Incorporated. So last week, some of these wrestlers had been in a 6-man cage match. They're going to be now wrestling for the titles again. The main event on this one was the first ever tag team Russian death match in southeastern Knoxville history. Ronnie Garvin, Toru Tanaka, going to be facing the great Malenko and the new masked man, the Destroyer, who many people would believe was Bob Roop. And Bob Roop had suddenly disappeared from southeastern wrestling, and along comes a guy that looks almost exactly like him, even wears the same outfit. So a lot of things are going on in Knoxville at this point.
Okay, so that is also a loaded card, Stud. All right, so who was on the TV show 6 days before this event to promote it?
Well, this TV recap is going to be a little shorter than usual because I didn't talk as much to Les about it as usual. I don't have as many notes, and so there was so much going on at this time, man. It was hard for me to keep up with everything. So I do know that the show opened up with Ronnie Garvin and Toru Tanaka, and they watched a video from the night before where the new masked Destroyer, for the second week in a row, got involved in the great Malenko Southeastern title defenses. He had done it 1 week when he wrestled Garvin for the belt. He had done it the next week when he wrestled Tanaka for the belt. And both times, this Destroyer managed to save Malenko's belt. And Garvin and Tanaka, for the first time in Southeastern history, were going to be partners. And the next Friday night, and they were going to be against Malenko and the Masked Destroyer. And it's going to be in a Russian death match. So while the video ended this extraordinary, when it ended, with this extraordinary Garvin and Tanaka team. Wow, it's a pretty amazing team. They went to the ring as soon as the video was over. And Les said, man, they got a tremendous standing ovation from the studio audience. They got obviously a powerful win, and they returned to the set for the first interview of the show about their Russian death match the following Friday night. Jimmy Golden and Rip Smith started the second segment of the show with the tag team championship belts in front of them. They were the champions. They showed a video from 2 weeks earlier where they had won the belts. They showed Tanaka in their corner, and he was able to keep Ron Wright out of the match, and they were able to get the win for the belts. And they got him from Ron Wright's almost unbeatable champions. Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson were a tremendous team. The studio fans obviously loved that video. And then Ron Wright certainly didn't, though. So he brought his team after they got a win. The two boys at the set, he brought his team to the ring, and Golden, as soon as they finished the video, he sat down to have some comments as his boys wrestled. And he rambled on, man. Les said he rambled on about everything from his new mass destroyer to Kevin Sullivan's bounty that he had offered up to having so many wrestlers now. Ron Wright said that he had to incorporate himself to protect all the money he was making. So while this was going on, Les said his team totally demolished their opponents, which wasn't unusual for those two boys. And then Wright and his team started a second interview from the set with Golden and Smith in the Studio B. And Les said Ron Wright opened the interview saying that match his team had just won was a perfect example of how good old Tennessee dog whooping they were, and they were going to give another Tennessee dog whooping on Friday night to the boys in Chilhowee Park. And they're going to get their precious tag team belts back, put them around their waist. I'm going to strap them on. He went on and on, as Ron Wright was only capable of doing, man. Not many people could do what he did, man, on the microphone. Then Golden and Smith, they had their interview from Studio B, and obviously they had other thoughts. So either way, the following Friday night, there was going to be a Tennessee dogfight there, no doubt. So the personality profile was with the hottest young star in southeastern Knoxville at that point, Kevin Sullivan. And for a change, Les said the profile was just that. Lots of conversation. This is the way profiles were set up to be, to find out what what was going on in their lives and all this, a conversation basically. This one started out with lots of conversation, Les said. Kevin talked about his Boston childhood, where he came from. Talked about his love for Eastern Tennessee and the fans there, man. And they loved him. Wow, he had really, really kind of taken the hearts of the Tennessee fans. It was really crazy to watch how easily he got over. And they did touch him toward the end of that profile on the bounty that Ron Wright had put on him, $5,000 for anyone that could put Kevin in the hospital. And then they talked about his upcoming bounty match with Ken Dillinger, a wrestler who happened to have a reputation for injuring people. So Kevin said he was more concerned about Ron Wright being at ringside with Dillinger than he was about Dillinger himself. And, it made sense to Les, and it sure made sense to the fans. Ron Wright was always interfering in the match. So Les told Kevin that he'd speak to the Southeastern officials when the profile was over to see if there's something that could be done about Ron Wright being at ringside. So Kevin was in the next match. He went straight into the ring, and Les went back to the set. And he got on the phone. And those people that have seen that Southeastern video from 1978 know that there's a phone on the edge of the desk there, and Les got on the phone, as he had promised Kevin, and he started talking to Southeastern officials about the Ron Wright situation. And then Phil Rainey, who was the ring announcer after he announced the match, he came, and he was sometimes the host, and he knew that Les was trying to get something done. He sat in, and he started describing the Sullivan match until Les got off the phone. soon as Les got off the phone, he was able to announce to the viewers that Ron Wright was not going to be allowed at ringside the following Friday night for the bounty match between Sullivan and Dillinger. And as you can imagine, Ron Wright heard it on a monitor in the dressing room, and here he came, directly to the set, and he started screaming at Les. And Phil Rainey took off because he was horrified with any confrontation with the wrestlers. He got out of the way real quick, and Sullivan ended his match. He won his match. He kind of saw what was happening at the set, and he went straight to the set. Ron Wright was just about to grab Les up. Les said, "I thought he was going to grab me, Ron, maybe slap me or something." And he said, so Sullivan went right to the set, and then suddenly Ken Dillinger, who was Kevin's opponent for the next Friday night, he just appeared from out of nowhere, and he was there to back up Ron Wright. So Les didn't want a problem at the set, and so he quickly just said, "Hey, let's take a commercial break. Let's get out of this." Basically, they avoided something bad, something that shouldn't have happening on the show.
Yeah, that might have been for the best. All right, but it seems to me, Ron, that Ron Wright has his hands in almost every match and almost everything going on in southeastern Knoxville, with the new Masked Destroyer, with the tag team champions, and now with Kevin Sullivan and that bounty. It's like Ron Wright, he's everywhere.
I mean, pretty astute of you, Dave, and he definitely was, and I think maybe Bob Roop, who was the new booker southeast of Knoxville at this point, and he obviously was very fond of Ron Wright. So remind me later, man, and we'll get back to this subject because we're going to talk a little bit about the wrestling war. But for right now, as they say in sports, let's return to the action, okay? So we'll get back to it. So then after the commercial break, then they had stopped, that had actually potentially stopped a bad scene at the set. Sullivan went into Studio B for the next interview, and Ron Wright and his henchman, Ken Dillinger, were on the set with Les. And as soon as the red light went on, Ron Wright, as usual, jumped right on it. Man, he got right into it, and he was threatening Les, and then he was really upset that he had been barred from ringside the next Friday night, and for the $5,000 bounty match, and then thankfully, Ken Dillinger, he kind of pulled right back from Les. Wright was angry with it, getting involved, and now you've got me kicked out of being able to be at ringside. I want to see my man do the job, and so he was about to get on Wright, and Dillinger grabbed a hold of his own manager, so to speak, and he told Ron Wright to settle down. He said, and very calmly, Dillinger was very calm. He says, I'm going to get this job done for you, and just as I've done in a whole lot of places around the country. And, I guarantee you, Kevin Sullivan is headed for the hospital next Friday night. And that he was more concerned about Wright having his bounty money when the job was done. So, yeah, he basically said, well, I'm not so sure about you, man. Can you give me this $5,000? So, Ron Wright's money was pretty good. He was, like you said, involved in everything. He's really got it going. And he reached in his pocket and he brought out a handful, Les said, $100 bills, man.
Hello.
Wow. So, yeah, and hello, that's it. And Les said, I couldn't take any more at that point, Ron. Now we're paying people right there to hurt people. And he said, I threw the remainder of the interview to Kevin. They said, let's take it to Studio B with Kevin, right?
Wow.
So this match, basically, with that kind of build-up, it really had real impact for the following Friday night.
Oh, I definitely say that, Stud. All of this attention was making our young wrestler a big star and also making Ron Wright a very hot heel again.
Well, both Kevin and Wright deserved it, basically. I mean, Kevin was a great worker. Ron Wright was a legend, I guess is a good word for it.
Easily, yeah.
So the last TV match of the show was with the great Malenko. and the Mass Destroyer. And they were setting the stage, maybe, well, obviously for the upcoming Russian Death Tag match that was coming up the next Friday night. They left both their opponents laying, and I mean really laying, because Malenko stomped his man unconscious, which he loved to do on all of his matches. And the Destroyer used his extremely dangerous shoulder breaker on the other opponent. Now, he had hurt Bill Golden with it. He had hurt anybody he ever did that move to, they got hurt. And neither of those two young guys that they did this to walked away from the ring. And the one that got the shoulder breaker from the Destroyer had to be taken to the hospital for x-rays. So, and that made a pretty big statement beyond what mere words could.
That was another fantastic TV, no doubt. So 500 miles north of where the other territory was producing one on the same afternoon is all that was going on. So how about the result of the Knoxville matches Friday, October 20th, 1978?
Well, Terry Gibbs won the special 30-minute time limit match. He beat George McCrary. Mike Stallings got a very impressive win over hippie Mike Boyett. Mike Stallings was still a good wrestler, and it was going to start to be used a lot better. The $5,000 Ron Wright bounty match with Kevin Sullivan against Ken Dillinger took place without Ron Wright at ringside. He came down with Ken Dillinger thinking he's going to get away with it, but he was escorted back to the dressing room by the men in blue, the Knoxville police. I think they probably enjoyed that, sacking him up and taking him back to the dressing room. Wright didn't show up at the ringside, obviously, and the Destroyer did, but the Destroyer did, and he got everyone in the building on his feet when he came. Destroyer had Kevin up on his shoulder, and he was going to give him a shoulder breaker, and I guess he would have collected the money without doubt, because that would have probably sent Kevin to the hospital, no doubt. But Tanaka was in the back, and he saw the Destroyer come to the ring, and he went. And he got in the ring, and he actually pulled Kevin right off the masked man's shoulder, man, to keep him from doing the move. And he and Tanaka and Tanaka and Destroyer got into it. They fought the outside of the ring, and Kevin Sullivan continued his march to being a star, man. He quickly put the Quahanus to Ken Dillinger in the middle of the ring, and wow, he was really at this point getting over. The building was still on their feet. Malenko and Tanaka, Tanaka and the Destroyer are fighting out there on the floor, and Malenko came down to the ring, and then Ronnie Garvin saw what was going on, and he came down to the ring, and instead of the Russian death match being last, it started right then. There's no stopping it. They just tried to announce it. They never got a normal announcement. The fight was going on, and the announcer just announced it from the floor. They rang the bell, and that match was underway. And it was a pretty grueling match. Those Russian death matches and Russian chain matches were always bloody. And three of the guys were bleeding for much of the match. And then it was finally won by the great Malenko and the Destroyer team. And then then Ron Wright's great Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson team was the last match of the night, and they re-won. They regained their Southeastern tag belts against Jimmy Golden and Rip Smith, but without Ron Wright's help, because it was it was a no DQ match, and Ron Wright, he interfered because he didn't have to worry about the DQ. And he actually used his chisel on Jimmy Golden that night, and he not only busted him up, but he knocked him out. And the four wrestlers in the tag team war were just beginning, man. These four were going to go at it again for several weeks.
Wow, that's another great night of wrestling for fans from Kentucky all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So the card in Knoxville had started, this is cool, just 1 hour before the one in Dothan, Alabama, 500 miles to the south. Time change is the difference, East Coast time and then Central time. So what was the attendance at this Knoxville event?
Well, it was in the Jacobs building, like I mentioned it there earlier, in Chilhowee Park, where the size of the crowd obviously was very limited by the size of the building. So they still managed to squeeze in about 4,000 fans. That was more than I ever thought that they would get in there.
Wow.
And Les said probably 1,000 more were turned away that couldn't get in the arena that night.
Holy cow. All right, so it's a shame that the park building was not any larger. If I recall correctly, you said Dothan on this same night in southeastern Gulf Coast, you had over 5,000 fans.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we had over 5,000 and 4,000 in Knoxville. Knoxville's building was the problem, and we were going to be in that building 2 more times before the end of the year, but the Coliseum on all the other events. So it wasn't going to limit us very much. So the Gulf Coast territory outdrew the Knoxville territory in this week that we're talking about by more than 6,000 fans. And it was amazing. Knoxville had been in business for 4 years, and the Gulf Coast territory had been in business for less than 8 months.
That's awesome. All right, that kind of fast growth after struggling so hard to build Knoxville had to be hard for you to believe.
Oh, yeah, it definitely was, man. But I was certainly happy to see it, I can tell you that.
I mean, it's like literally rolling the dice. In the beginning, you had no idea what would happen. And then one night you're going, wow, we've got these 2 incredible shows going at the same time. All right, you said to ask you later about my question of why it seemed Ron Wright was being involved in so many things in southeastern Knoxville during this time period in 1978.
Yeah, and thanks for reminding me about this, man. And I'm just mulling over my mind here a little bit about this whole thing. So I think what was happening with Ron Wright and the Knoxville booker, Bob Roop, was kind of the beginning of what was going to be one of the factors that brought about the Knoxville War in 1979. At this point, Roop had been there for a booker for about a month, and friendships and business relationships were being created basically from the moment he started as the booker, and he had been a wrestler there before becoming the booker. And at this point, my brother had left Southeastern, Knoxville, to head down south to the Gulf Coast. He left actually the first week in September of 78. I wasn't there. So we weren't able to see what was actually going on in Knoxville very much. And this is kind of, we're still very early in this continuing discussion of basically, for me, the worst year in my wrestling career, 1979. And I think all Studcast fans are going to be blown away with this remarkable story of the Knoxville Wrestling War 1979. Could do many Studcasts just based upon that. And the best part of this is, in the coming months, the Studcast, being able to do this in a Studcast and talk about it in a Studcast over a long period of time, is going to allow me to go into greater depth about this subject than I ever have before.
Hey, I'm pretty sure everybody out there and the fans around the world that know little about it are looking forward to one of the sport's really, truly historic stories as much as I am. And listen, I'm sorry, Stud, but I don't think we're going to have enough time for a learning tree question today. It's been another great look into 2 territories, Southeastern operation in 1978. Just really good stuff. Hopefully next week we'll have time for everything, including another learning tree question. In the meantime, folks, on Facebook, Ron has thousands of Facebook friends and on his 3 sites. So he appreciates every one of them, of course. One site is full. Can't take more friends there. To become a friend on Facebook, go to Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud, or Ron Fuller Welch site on Facebook. Like him, follow him there, automatically become friends with a legend. On Twitter, it's simple. Ron Fuller Welch. Ron Fuller Welch on Twitter. Follow him there. The YouTube channel, Southeastern Rewind. It's filled with all kinds of information and videos. It also is a great place to find out more about what's new on his tremendous streaming channel, ClassicContinentalWrestling.com. Speaking of which, ClassicContinentalWrestling.com is where you find everything that is the Tennessee Stud. His old school Southeastern Continental and USA TV shows that now number in the hundreds are there. A new 3-hour Stars of the Sport, Super Studcast with former NWA champ Terry Funk and Stan Hansen with, for the first time, photos from the beginning to the end. The 9th chapter of his thrilling Lion novel, the story Brutus, is now there too, in audio form. Well over 300 hours of wrestling entertainment, and it grows every week. Subscribe now and begin the wrestling ride of your life. It's only $4.99 per month, $39.99 per year. It gets you the best old school wrestling streaming channel on the planet, no doubt. The 1-week free trial is still available. It is the best deal in wrestling. All right, Stud, where do we ride next week?
Well, Southeastern Knoxville has a tremendous card next week. It's another Garvin versus Malenko Southeastern title match, but this time the special referee is going to be none other than Tanaka. We've got a Southeastern tag team title match again. We got a bounty match. This time it's going to be with Tanaka and Kevin Sullivan against the Destroyer and Ron Wright himself in the ring. They're also going to be a Southeastern, again, Gulf Coast. It's not going to be outdone, I can tell you that. It has 2 loser leave matches. One of them with me against Carson, and the second one is a tag match with my brother and my father, Buddy Fuller, in the ring against the Assassins. And plus there's 2 championship matches on that same card. So hopefully next week we'll also have time for another learning tree. And I want to thank all the listeners again today for joining us. And please tell your friends about what we do here if you enjoy what you hear. And take care of yourselves and others, and may God bless us all.
Always so much fun. Thanks, Stud. For Ron Fuller in the Great Smoky Mountains, I'm David Summers saying thank you for listening. Find me at davidsummersproductions@gmail.com. This Studcast is a David Summers production for Tennessee Stud, LLC.
Thanks for joining us today for this historic Studcast. The true story continues next week. So full Nelson your friends and point them in our direction for another ride with the Tennessee Stud.
1, 2, 3.
This is David Summers saying so long from the Great Smoky Mountains.